Hey guys, my name is Alexander Ferreira. I'm making this video for my paper presentation project for CS 6263 Summer 2020. So we're going to be looking at basically a summary of watching the watchers automatically inferring TV content from outdoor light effusions. The original researchers are listed there from UNC Chapel Hill, as well as a link if you'd like to check it out. Really great paper. Or not, because I'm about to summarize it here, so you probably don't need to check it out. But all right, motivations. So who would want to collect this, and why should you care about it? Your viewing habits can reveal plenty of personal information about yourself. Be it your religious beliefs, political views, private interests. I mean, even the U.S. government considers it sensitive information. I'm sure that someone could come up with a nefarious scheme for it. Or just monetizable opportunities, targeted advertising. I mean, just selling your personal information as it is. In today's world, we've pretty much given it all away for free, and there's a huge market for it. Or something like viewership data. Consider it like a next generation Nielsen, given that with cable viewership down and content delivery is really evolving into all these different streaming platforms. This would provide a way to monitor what people are watching platform independent. And it's worth noting here that nearly every U.S. home still owns at least one TV, and nearly 70% of Americans regularly watch television while having dinner. So it's definitely still central to in-home viewership. There has been some related work in the area. For instance, there was a study using power line electromagnetic interference. There were some limitations, however, since it depended largely on your TV model, your power system, and attacker knowledge of those from the target's setup, as well as specialized equipment and the know-how to use it. Another similar study looked at compromising reflections, off of shiny objects, the viewer's eyeballs, but at the end of the day, it was still required a direct view of the screen via reflections, as opposed to, in this case, where we're looking at just the light effusions, the intensity and the patterns of those changes in brightness. And that would also have required expensive, especially at range, high-quality equipment in order to get a clear view of the screen to evaluate. Okay, so from like a high-level overview of what we're going to be looking at here is captured footage. This may be light reflecting off of a wall or through a window on some blinds, and then extracting usable features from that data that can then be extrapolated to determine what reference source material is being viewed. So we'll look at some of the search and retrieval algorithms that are used, and how that is able to find the best match for from a reference library. What is the closest material that the target may be viewing? So starting out with capture, as I said, you're going to use a camera to capture the light reflections from the screen onto other surfaces. That could be an adjacent or an opposite wall, a window, some curtains, something like that. We're going to be looking at the changes in brightness and how that results in distinctive flickering patterns, like what you might see if you think about if you're looking away from a TV and you can see the brightness in the room changing based on what is in the scene. The likelihood of success is really going to be influenced by a few key factors, including the quality of capture, that is your signal to noise ratio, the entropy of the observed information. So that's going to be dependent on the amount of variation. You can have really accurate brightness, change data, but if there aren't a lot of changes, then there's not really a lot of useful information. And then the length of the captured signal, obviously longer is better. You have more window of opportunity for changes to occur, and to get like a more confident match to reference material. And then the size of your library. It's worth noting there that in the worst case, the amount of information needed to uniquely identify a video is logarithmic with its total length, which in turn is linearly related to the size of the attacker's library. So we'll get into that a little bit more later as well. So looking first at the signal to noise ratio, you can kind of think about that as the ratio of the captured signal, that is what you're looking for, as opposed to all the other stuff, all the additive light that is inadvertently captured from any other illuminating source in the room. It is worth noting there that the intensity of a constant room light doesn't really influence the signal noise ratio directly, since it doesn't influence the noise variance. it indirectly affects the quantization noise, given that it affects the sensitivity of the sensor's camera. But really what we're looking at here in these sigma squared are the variance of a signal. And that's something that could be measured to determine what the noise component of this captured signal is, using like an instance where there's a static image on the screen, or it can also just be reasonably approximated. And it does have a significant impact, correlation between the SNR and the rate at which you're able to collect information. So intuitively, things like lower screen brightness, smaller and darker reflecting objects, longer distances, those will all limit the amount of screen light captured by the adversary. And the more noise that there is, the higher that noise floor is, where those smaller changes aren't perceivable. To distinguish that versus just variance in the noise. Okay, feature extraction. So just want to touch really quick on gradients. Nearly 95% of consecutive frames have the same average intensity. So that means that frame to frame, there's not a lot of change that gives you useful information. So using gradients reduces kind of the overall correlation. It's kind of an edge detection method to identify sharp changes in intensity, which would allow you to basically take that 95% of consecutive frames that are the same and turn it into 95 0 points, where they're points that are not of interest. I'm not going to get into this math too much, but the P of X here can be observed directly from a reference video. The POI can be computed by ignoring some of the impact noises, which are rare, and assuming that the noise will follow a Gaussian distribution. So it's a lot of complicated looking math, but if you're not familiar with gradients, there's a good YouTube video listed here that'll just give you like a 5-minute overview on gradients as edge detection, since that's kind of in a sense what we're looking at here. The gist of it is that more intensity changes, will lead to more features and give you a better chance of identification. And so why that works and how this works is basically each pixel's brightness value will be averaged to give basically the frame and average intensity. And then to achieve the comparability between the two signals of the captured and the database reference footage, we characterize them by their frame-wise intensity gradient over time. So that's basically the sequence of these averages, and it gives you a coarse characterization of the captured signal. You can kind of see how that works in the graphics over here on the right, where you have the reference video signal, the captured follows similar trends, and then when you look at the features of the two, they will follow generally the same peaks, positive and negative, with sharp spikes. That's where you have major scene changes, daytime to nighttime, one day to another with a total setting change, gunshots, and anything like that. That's just a really sharp change in brightness from one scene to the next. Or actually, in this case, we look at the previous couple of frames. Here, even like impulse noise, turning the room light on and off, only would result in like a single one of these, extra peaks in the whole feature vector, and thus it has a pretty minor impact on the overall result. You can kind of think of this like a fast Fourier transform or something for how Shazam or Google Assistant will identify audio. Then again, also not at all, because the peaks are too sparse and localized changes are too subtle, but it is very similar in that it basically fingerprints the much more complex signal into something that you can characterize much more simply, and then with some similarity constants for comparison in a database with more like standardized algorithms. So it's only your ability to identify is only going to be as good as your reference library. You can't match it to something that you don't really have a reference data point for. Given the more and more people cutting the cord for cable, you have all these different sources out there. Your database needs to contain material from all of them. If that's popular streaming services, maybe cable is in your interest. Space, popular YouTube videos, offline media. This project will use a whole set of it that we'll look at before we get into the evaluation. But you want to have an exhaustive set of sources. So moving into the search and retrieval, how is this derived feature set actually used, right? So we've preserved this temporal gradient of only the local minima and maxima of length L here. This is your feature set of the captured signal. You have a feature set of the reference video that you're looking at. In this case, a feature set which is a subset of your reference feature set. No, that sounds kind of confusing. It's because you need the lengths to match to use this whole model, where you map the disturbance caused, the energy from the erroneous noise peaks and the missing peaks, in conjunction with this alpha coefficient that represents the weighting between the energy of the missing and noisy peaks and the correlation between the correct extrema. So given that the magnitudes of the peaks may be different between the captured and reference signals, the researchers relied on the temporal information primarily, which is more accurate. The noise energy is still necessary when distinguishing features in the cases of perfectly agreeing peaks, but in this case they empirically chose like a preset alpha for the experiments such that the temporal agreement of the peaks would dominate the metric. So there is definitely a significant drawback here, like I mentioned, with the length needing to be the same. If you want to expand that to be able to identify subsections of a recorded snippet of film in a database of entire film clips, you would need to consider every subsequence of length, that same captured length from each media reference, and that is just way too exhaustive, not really effective in practice. So in this case, they use another method to kind of simplify or narrow the scope of what is going to be evaluated with that similarity metric. So this is new peak feature, which will efficiently characterize the distribution of peaks. So a histogram of the pairwise distances between all the pairs of peaks is computed. So to model the fact that the stronger peaks are more reliable, the amount of increase is equal to the product of the peaks of magnitude. In that way, the peaks with larger magnitudes contribute more significantly to the histogram. So you can see that kind of here with the way that the bin structure is set up. And then there's also like a threshold that's applied to kind of ignore some of these lower peaks that are a lot of times going to be some of the noise, just any feature that doesn't fit a worthwhile identifying feature. So the peak feature is invariant to the starting point of the window, given that it only encodes the pairwise peak. So when the window slides across the set of frames, the peak feature will remain stable as long as there's no peak coming or going out. So shifting by from some frames normally doesn't really impact your peak feature. An entire video can then be represented as a set of its peak features by just dropping any redundant peak features. So once you have those peak features extracted, you'll select the peak features with the highest number of strong peaks. You'll index it, the peak feature set, into a KD tree, which is a search algorithm used in really high dimensional spaces. Recursively split the space with hyperplanes, which iteratively refines the possible locations of the data point. You'll select the result with the smallest Euclidean distance to captured video, retain that as the copy candidate, and then start repeating that process with whatever the next strongest peak feature is. And you'll repeat this process until the confidence on whatever your match is to the current candidate is high enough to be acceptable. In the case of this paper, they repeated until there were 3 consecutive matches on the same candidate. Note this is also for an offline approach, but it could be extended to an online streamable format by finding the current best match as you go, and then using that similarity metric discussed before between the separate choices that are identified to determine the best factor without needing the full exhaustive search of every subset of the database. So from results on how well this worked, in the paper's empirical evaluation, the reference library was 27 million peak features, representing 54,000 videos. And with this peak feature in the KD tree-based search, it reduced the search time on average to less than 10 seconds, which is pretty incredible. So getting into evaluation, this is the fun part of their data. The reference database just throughout included 10,000 movies at least an hour, 24,000 news clips, 10,000 music videos, 10,000 TV shows. Everything's varying length. In total, it was over or just about 19,000 hours of footage, with all the features and peak features pre-computed for the database as any attacker implementing this attack would have. Okay, here's just a quick view of the test setup. They're measuring the light emanations on a white wall that located 3 meters away from the television. They used a Logitech HD Pro webcam and a 60D Canon DSLR. So, low grade to mid grade equipment for what, the scope may be of an actual attacker, and using a 24-inch TV. So in the first test here with the lights off, success was considered on correct identification across all of these. There was no knowledge of the video playing or any setup knowledge leveraged. Random capture start time within the test video. They captured 62 sequences, and you really start to see that once you hit like this 120 seconds worth of capture, just 2 minutes, they were hitting over 54% identification rate. And I mean, really, once you got up to just a couple of minutes, a few minutes, that rate just really takes off. Where they're, it's very consistent, correctly identifying the piece of video media. So to better quantify the robustness, they evaluated the ratio and similarity between the video sequence returned as the best match and the true positive. If the ratio is larger than 1, that would imply that it always will correctly match at that time scale. And anything above that, it's just higher, it means that it was a more distinctive match. So an even higher confidence level. Obviously, that would depend on your library for this data. This is just one example from one piece of data collected. So the median similarity score you'll see rises above 1 between about 100 and 120 seconds. For longer sequences, it monotonically increases with increasing segment length. And then here in the second figure, you can see basically the ranking of the corresponding video with respect to the captured video's length for one of the test videos. So the results for your other videos were supposed to have been comparable. You kind of see the same data that it gets more and more, it gets closer and closer to being identified as the top, best guess of what the video was as you increase the length of time until even in the worst case, around that 120 second mark, it was getting it very consistently. And this is of the most and least discriminative subsequence. So this is probably something like an action scene, and then this would be some sort of scene that is not changing not a lot of light changes going on. Okay, and then with the lights on, it might seem like an obvious thought up front that turning on the lights in the room would create, raise the noise floor enough, or turning down the brightness on your TV, that this approach would not work. But the results indicate that the higher screen brightness levels make the retrieval slightly more successful, as it takes shorter segment lengths for successful retrieval, and the similarity ratio is higher. However, the influence of the screen brightness seems marginal. It can also be seen that even with the room light on, the attack was successful with moderate segment length in all cases. There was one failure with 270 seconds, but that same video piece did then pass at 300 seconds. It's also worth noting that in the case of an active room light, a human observer is not even able to perceive the resulting subtle intensity changes on the wall, but the camera obviously is. Okay, impact of screen size. Bigger TVs put more light out. There's more light to reflect off the wall. Data kind of showed exactly what you would expect. With larger screens, you had a much higher signal to noise ratio, and in turn, it took a lower segment length to correctly identify the work on average. So that data is presented here as well, graphically. Okay, impact of reference library. They tested with 3 different size database sets: 1,000 references, 4,000, and 54,000. That was, the bulk of the experiments. The larger the database, the longer the segments required to have a guarantee a successful retrieval, as you would expect. But when you increase the database size from 4,000 references to 54,000, a 13.5-fold increase, only a segment length needed to correctly identify the work was only increased by 20%. And it was suspected that that number would go down even less as you have more works. Those identifying overlapping sections are not expected to increase linearly. So what a real attack might look like. So in this case, this is from the street. Window emissions were observed from 13.5 meters away. This is across the street in the sidewalk, looking at a third floor office window. All segments above 180 seconds were successful for every different media type tested. You can see here they did TV shows, music videos, film, across all the different types. 180 seconds was really like the magic point where it was always successful. But even if you look much lower than that, even around 120, it was pretty consistently capturing it. And this was with across 20 different samples of each type and using a Canon camcorder. Okay, and here we have a real attack from down the street. So who's looking from across the sidewalk? You're gonna look like a weirdo looking at windows. How about down the street? This is 71 meters away, same test, same camera. Even at this distance, it was able to successfully retrieve 18 out of the 20 samples across all media types, shown within at least 5 minutes. In the worst case, the sequence can usually be retrieved within 100 seconds at 13.5 meters, compared to around 190 on average from 70 meters away. Still, I mean, we're talking about 70 something meters, 3 minutes to identify what you're watching. All right, so you don't like high-tech peepers watching your TV. What are some things that you can do? In the paper, they looked at a couple different mitigation strategies, including blackout curtains. They tested 2 different samples on the below setup with vinyl blinds and sheer curtains, and then with the blackout curtains versus the regular window. In the case of the vinyl blinds and the sheer curtains, 3 out of 4 tests were still able to be identified within 270 seconds, and 1 reference did fail after 5 minutes. And then again, tested with the blackout curtains, there were actually 0 reference pieces were able to be identified. Another option might be reducing your screen brightness, though as we've seen earlier, that is not necessarily a foolproof strategy. You would need to be your brightness would need to fall consistently below that noise floor. Most likely this would burden the attacker by requiring a higher collection time, but would not impede them from actually eventually capturing the data that they're looking for. One last option entertained would be floodlights pointed at your windows. That might annoy your neighbors, and it would also not defend against any high dynamic range cameras that a better equipped attacker may have if they can have like the ISO and aperture range to still get either pull out just those small changes in the brighter overall signal. Okay, so in conclusion, this paper empirically proved the feasibility of a novel attack utilizing light diffusion through windows as reflected off surfaces in order to reliably identify specific media content, video media content. The attack was generally successful in a reasonably low amount of time, generally under 4 minutes, and at a highly variable distance using only low-cost equipment. Some of the mitigation strategies were discussed, however, all with noteworthy limiting factors beyond blackout curtains. So use protection, blackout curtains aren't just for sleeping in anymore. All right, thanks. That's all I got. Drop your questions in Piazza. Thanks for watching.